My name is Mrs. Brand. If I haven't met you before, hopefully we met at open house or launch day. This is an overview of British literature, and this is for two different classes. So there's one class of British literature over at Foursquare in Byron Center, and another British literature class in Zealand at First Edition. So just so you know, you guys are doing a lot of the same stories, not all the same stories. You might be doing very similar authors, but not necessarily all the same stories. But on the stories that you are doing that are together, you'll probably hear me reference each other. So just want to tell you up front that you have friends across West Michigan who are doing a lot of the same things that you are doing. So you can say hello to them. British literature. If we were to take a puzzle and say it had 1,000 pieces, and I pull out 5 puzzle pieces or 10 puzzle pieces, what would the picture of that puzzle look like? If that's all you had, or those 5 pieces or those 10 pieces, would you be able to identify the complete picture? No, it would just be the start. You would barely even be able to frame out the edges of that puzzle, let alone identify the specific nuances and patterns and shapes and colors that come together to form a complete picture of a puzzle. The same can be said in our attempt to study British literature. This year, we will read great works of the giants of English literature, stories that have stood the test of time and been enjoyed by millions of people around the globe. These works that we will encounter, say a play, poems, a novel, they are just a few pieces of the puzzle that make up the entirety of British literature. It would take a lifetime to read all that there is to read in this canon of British literature. In this class, I am your tour guide. I will give you frameworks for understanding stories. We will open books together and marvel at the wonder of imagination and the beauty of story. And my hope is that at the end of the year, your thirst for learning and reading and growing will drive you deeper into reading more great works, that you will continue to pick up the puzzle pieces and work towards a more clearly defined picture of what story is, as well as deepen your understanding of grace and the redemptive story that God has written on all of our hearts. Our task before us is to study British literature. Here we go. I'd like to start you off with a brief overview of the literary time periods that come to bear on our British literature class. This is a great time to take notes, pause the video, grab your binder if you don't have it, pen, pencil, highlighter, whatever you need. Or you can listen along if you're just an audio person and write a narration at the end. That would be a great thing to do. But I would recommend that you take down the notes of the dates, the specific dates that I give you. Stories have existed for the dawn of time, since the dawn of time. Our first stories come to us from the Bible, of course, all the accounts of creation and God's plan for his people. We get story from myths, fairy tales, fables, legends, folklore. All of these stories feed into our understanding of the British tradition of literary works and into the imagination of British writers. The beauty of story is that they all talk to each other. Moderns believe that stories relate to us. In a way, they kind of do, but they're not like it's not the driver in the car, right? Moderns would say, what does a story say about me? Do I like it? But stories are intended to relate to each other, not to us. The writers of the great stories of England are standing on the great stories that came before them. So as we read Dickens, as we read Shakespeare, as we read Oscar Wilde or whoever I'm going to put right in front of you, those writers are working within a very well-established literary tradition. In our understanding of the stories we will read, it will be imperative that we make connections to other stories and allow those stories to talk to each other. That might make more sense as we grow in our understanding of stories and as you get to know me a little bit better in the coming semester. Let's begin with a basic framework of literary time periods. I'm going to walk you through a basic understanding. Please know I am painting with a very wide brush here. Each of these time periods could be a class in and of themselves. In fact, they are. If you go on to higher ed, you can take a class just devoted to the Anglo-Saxons. You could take a class just devoted to Shakespeare, just Milton, classes that specifically are devoted to the poets of a certain given time period. Remember that all the pieces of the puzzle that I talked about before, we're not going to cover everything. But I want us to begin with an understanding of generally accepted time periods of literary study. All right, let me see if I can turn the slide here. Let's begin by looking at just the list of what time periods we have. Now, this is the generally accepted list of literary time periods. It also coincide with like historical time periods or intellectual movements. You might run across other names for things, but these are generally accepted. The dates, however, not I want to say generally accepted, I guess, but there's a lot of room for wiggle. Like specifically the medieval time period, C.S. Lewis would say that any dates that you stick on the medieval time period are probably wrong. It probably far extends into what we would consider the Renaissance time period. All right, so the Anglo-Saxons is where we're going to start, where we're going to begin, and then we'll move to medieval and then Renaissance. And then I won't cover it in today's video, but the Enlightenment, the Age of Romanticism, the Victorian, the Moderns, and the Postmoderns will come to bear later on in our class. If you want to pause the video right now, this is a great time to either screen capture, take a picture, or write down these literary time periods, because I do want you to know them. Let's begin with the Anglo-Saxons. When you hear this term, what do you think of? Anglo-Saxons. These guys are tough, right? Some might say warriors, Vikings, nomads. All of these are good images when we consider who the Anglo-Saxons were. So you got to consider what was happening with Rome. Rome at the time had entertained a long period of control of the British Isles, what we know to be today as England. They built roads and towns and military installations. It was home to the Romans, but it was also home to like the Celts. So there's kind of this intermingling, but definitely the Romans were dominating in that area. Well, in the 4th and 5th century, Rome started suffering a lot of political instability. The fall of Rome, right? And they've got all these different territories around them, and they're starting to struggle to maintain control. And so what they do is they start pulling back. They start withdrawing their troops from their territories. And Rome's continuing problems caused them to really empty out the British Isles, all of their military installations. What does that leave behind? It just kind of leaves a mess. There's a lot of fighting and infighting and lots of destruction. And the land is now going to become filled with all these different tribal factions. Little kingdoms, if you will, little territories run by chiefs, or king here, or king there, or king here. No longer do we have this centralized government or centralized authority. But what happens when you have all these little kingdoms all over the place? You leave yourself wide open for attack. And what begins to happen is you get these invaders from the north coming down. You have the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. They start coming and inhabiting the British Isles. And this is where we get the picture of Vikings, marauders, invaders, and all these warrior tribes fighting for power and glory and honor and territory. And what begins to happen is these people start to settle. And you get this amalgamation, this kind of hodgepodge soup pot of cultures, language, customs, so that the early England that we would know has a blend of Roman influences, Celtic influences, Germanic influences that all kind of mix together to create what we know as these early Britons. Okay, so during kind of this time, Pope Gregory, Catholic leader of the Church of Rome, he sends missionaries there to save these poor wicked pagans. And 40 monks, led by Augustine of Canterbury, take off to go convert these Anglo-Saxons, right, from paganism to Christianity. The story goes that Augustine of Canterbury and his men, on their journey, if they make these little stops on their way to the British Isles, and they hear all these stories about these ferocious Vikings and marauders and the nature of these Anglo-Saxon people. And they're terrified, and they turn back and they go back to Rome. And Pope Gregory has to convince them they need to hear about Christianity. So he sends them back. Gregory convinces them to journey back, and the land of Kent is where they land. And Kent is ruled by King Ethelbert, who is a pagan. I gotta stop our story right here. My battery's about to die. Just one moment. I'm gonna pause. Hold on. I'm gonna pause. I'll be right back. So King Ethelbert is a pagan, and he is married to Bertha. She's a Christian. And he's converted. And so Augustine of Canterbury and his missionaries begin to spread the gospel, the Christian story, and they begin to establish churches, monasteries, and they are instrumental in bringing Christianity to England. So when you look at Anglo-Saxon literature and stories, what you're going to have is a blend of all these pagan stories, pagan ideas, with Christian ideas. Let's go back to the slide for just a moment here. I think we were on this one right here. There we go. All right, Anglo-Saxon time period. So the literary tradition of the Anglo-Saxons is very much an oral tradition. If you studied ancient literature, you know that the Iliad, the Odyssey, those were all stories told that were passed on from generation to generation. It wasn't later that they were written down into what we know, the collected works of Homer. So storytelling was the tradition, the literary tradition, and poems are marks of Anglo-Saxon literature. So in total, we have about 30,000 lines, maybe 31,000, I had read once, of Anglo-Saxon works. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot when you consider how many works of literature that exist in the world that come from that European area. But to think that 30,000 lines of poetry have survived is absolutely stunning, I think. And we do have some beautiful examples of Anglo-Saxon literature. If you are in my first edition group, your mind should be already going ding, ding, ding. I know what she's talking about. Okay, so who were the writers of this time period? Well, they were the monks. They were educated. So they were the ones that began collecting stories and writing down stories. And there's a wonderful book about how it was monks who actually preserved a lot of the stories that we have from the ancient tradition, from the early Anglo-Saxons. Just fascinating. But the monks were the ones that begin to write down these stories. And so you get this religious content intermingled with these kind of pagan ideas. What kind of themes would you see in Anglo-Saxon literature? Stories about a king and his people. Does that sound familiar? Warfare. Poems about exile and return. That one's called The Wanderer. Revenge stories. So remember, if you have all these little warring factions going on, you have a culture where, say, one warring tribe kills a brother of this king, and so they have to take revenge on this tribe, and it just goes on and on and on, and it never ends. Some of that is going to be found in the story of Beowulf. Beowulf is the largest work from this time period, and it is a fascinating story. It is so good. If you've been with me in first edition the last 2 years, you have read Beowulf with me. And if you remember, it is full of all kinds of just great story lines, right? Arms being ripped off of a monster, a bubbling lake filled with blood and serpents, a dragon sitting on a treasure, guarding the treasure. Does that sound like anything? Does that remind you of any story? Tolkien was a great lover of Beowulf. He was an academic scholar, teacher, professor who studied the works of the Anglo-Saxons and their languages. And Even, okay, there is a book of Beowulf. It's not a translation. It's really more Tolkien's notes that he used to teach Beowulf. And then later when he died, I think his son had them printed into a book, but it's not necessarily the translation, but there is a translation of Beowulf by Tolkien. But Tolkien was highly influenced by these stories. And if you are a lover of Lord of the Rings, you are going to see echoes of the Anglo-Saxon world all over the place. That makes sense. All right. So that's the Anglo-Saxons. We are not starting there, unfortunately, because we just can't, right? I had to pick some puzzle pieces, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of Anglo-Saxon literature. We'll kind of talk a little bit about it. But those of you who are in first edition, you've got this already. You've already read Beowulf, so you've got this great picture of the Anglo-Saxons. I think it was it C.S. Lewis or Tolkien who said you can't study English literature without starting with Beowulf. So if you haven't read it yet, I strongly recommend that you just read it in your free time, just for fun. It's a great story. We're going to start in the Renaissance period. That's where we're starting. But I do want to give you this picture of the Anglo-Saxons, because all the writers that come after are pulling from this literary tradition. Okay. And the next literary tradition that we're going to kind of cover is the medieval time period. And a lot of people think about medieval and they think, oh, those were the Dark Ages. No. The medievals were not the Dark Ages. In many ways, the medievals knew more than we did. C.S. Lewis would say the Middle Ages depend predominantly on books. And this is a very important quote because it gives us an understanding of one of the most influential inventions of all time. And that would be the printing press. In the 1450s, Johann Gutenberg is printing poems, and he's working on printing the Gutenberg Bible. And with the onset of printing, a mass spread of books across Europe opens up a new world as stories and scripture become accessible to the everyday man. Now, the medieval time period is a special love of mine, and Shakespeare draws so much from the medieval time period. And so to understand Shakespeare, you really have to understand the medieval time period. If you are familiar with C.S. Lewis as a writer of the Narnia series, you've probably enjoyed those books. It's important to note that C.S. Lewis was a medievalist. He studied and chaired the Medieval and Renaissance Department at Cambridge University. And so much of what we know, we owe to C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to talk about something that maybe you've never heard before. If you're in my FA classes, you probably have, because I've covered this a little bit, but you need to hear it over and over again. Because we're moderns, and moderns don't think this way. We have to relearn how to think. I'm going to talk a little bit about medieval cosmology. So what does the word cosmology mean? It's not cosmetology. I'm not talking about makeup and hair and stuff. I'm talking about cosmology. So cosmos, right? The world. How do we see the world? How is the world made up? So the medieval cosmology is really important to understand. It's a way of seeing the world. And for medieval man, the kinds of things that he saw or were important to him were order, harmony, hierarchy. They saw everything ordered. There was a rightly ordered universe, right? That man would be rightly ordered, that there's a right order to our affections, that there's a right order to government, to a kingdom. And so they would see that there was a right order of things. C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, The Discarded Image, to look up at the towering medieval universe is like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilder the reverie. So if I'm a modern person, I'm looking up at space, right? And I'm like, what is out there? Is there a God? Like, it's all so big and scary, right? That would not be true for the medieval. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest. So the medievals rested in the right order of the universe. What he's saying here is that to a modern, to look at the sky brings up all these questions of uncertainty, right? But to a medieval, the universe was beautifully ordered. There was harmony. Everything had a place, and everything needed to be in its right place. One could rest if things worked this way. Then there was harmony. This is an important idea to grasp. It is the playground in which the early writers lived. Some important writers of this time period: Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio. These are Italian writers who deeply influenced the English writers, and I might mention them, but just important to note. Okay, let me illustrate the medieval cosmology, the idea of how the world, I just can't spend enough time on this. There was this thing called the Great Chain of Being, and it's this picture. I'm not sure if you can see it because my screen is over the top of it. I don't know. But you probably have a different screen than mine. But I'm looking here at this image, this picture. And this is a picture of the Great Chain of Being. And it's so detailed, it's hard to understand. So just kind of step back and look at the big picture. What do you see? What's going on? What's happening on the top? What's happening on the bottom? What's happening along that side? Something's falling down. They have wings. So what could this be, right? So the medievals believed that there was an order to the universe. So who will be at the top? If there's an order, if there is a structure, who's on top? Well, that would be God, right? God is on top. And heavenly beings would fall underneath him. You kind of see that in the picture. I'm pointing at it, but you can't see me pointing at it. But look at the top of the picture. Do you see the angels with the wings? All right. They are the highest authority. This is a very Christian idea. And in the picture, you see multiple images that fall under God's authority. So God's at the top. Well, who would be next? Well, you have the angels. And under the angels, you would have man. And under man, you would have animals. And under that, you would have plants. And under that, you would have matter until you descend to the lowest rungs of the chain, which bring you to hell and Satan and the fallen angels. Do you see this chain of being, this understanding of the world according to the medievals? Within this hierarchy means, there's going to be somebody on top and somebody on bottom. You could take one category and identify the order within it. For example, humans have a hierarchy. To the medieval, the king would be at the top, or depending on the given time, the pope would be on top. But to the medievals, it would be the king. And then underneath that would be nobles, the church, the laymen, the squires, the peasants, the serfs, kind of in descending order. Think about the animal kingdom. If the animal kingdom is the kingdom, who's in charge? Who's the ruler? Well, the lion, right? He's the king of the jungle. And under the larger animals, you would have smaller animals. You have this order. In the medieval cosmology, when things were rightly ordered, when things were in their place, in the right places, you had harmony. I want you to keep this idea in mind because we will talk about this, and especially the idea of a rightly ordered man when we begin reading Much Ado About Nothing, because this is the world that Shakespeare was drawing from. This is the literary time period. Remember I said they're standing on the shoulders of the time period before them? Shakespeare is drawing from this medieval time period. Let me illustrate this idea of medieval cosmology another way. Advance this slide here. Okay. The first picture was of a chain and it was really complicated and detailed. This is just simply going to be a ladder. Something is on top and then things fall underneath. So, like I said before, God would be at the top, and then angels, and then humans, and then animals, and then plants, and then minerals. So say that a human who's underneath God wants to thwart God or overrule God and goes on top. What happens? You have a disordered universe. Just something like that happened in the Bible. Think about an angel that wanted to be God, wanted to be above God. And that created chaos and disorder. This happens in Shakespeare's writing all the time. If you read Macbeth with me in first edition, think about Macbeth, who wanted to rise above the king, and it created disorder in the entire universe. All of nature was disordered because of this act. Everything was disordered. The kingdom was disordered. Everything was total chaos. And by chaos, I don't mean like, hey, you go to an event and it's not organized very well. No. By chaos, I mean like the whole world is in disorder. because uh, because Macbeth kills the king. Sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't read it. So this kind of ideology, this kind of cosmology really didn't get displaced until the Enlightenment period. And we'll talk about that later in the school year. This is a really important idea to consider. If we look at the modern understanding of the world, so not a medieval understanding of the world, who's on top of the ladder? Who would fall underneath? So in a modern understanding of the world, I think you're going to get something that looks like this. There's no ladder. In the modern understanding of the world, there is no hierarchy. Now, I'm not saying this in terms of like the Christian worldview. Like in your home, think about the hierarchy in your home, right? Well, in my home, it's Mr. Brand. He's at the top. And he and I are equal, but like he's the king of the jungle in our house. Hopefully that's true of your house too. Your dad, not Mr. Brand, but your dad, right? Think about if you came home today and you say, or you get done with your class and you walk out and you say, "Hey, Dad, I'm gonna take the car and I'm gonna go spend all your money. And there's nothing you can do about it. Ha ha ha." You might have a problem, right? You might have to have a conversation with your dad about that to find out who's really in charge. The modern understanding of the universe does not run on a medieval hierarchy, does not run in a medieval cosmology. The modern understanding of the world puts me at the center. There is nothing above me, no authority, no hierarchy. You can't tell me what to do. I chart my own course. If it feels good, do it. My body, my choice. I could go on and on. Modern man has completely rejected the idea of a rightly ordered universe. This idea is huge and will come to bear on so much of we read that is essential this year to see this picture and to understand. One of the excellent teachers that I follow, her name is Angelina Stanford, and she says this: boundaries and limits are God's love to us. And when we cross boundaries, they lead to self-destruction. Modern man does not want limits. Modern man does not want boundaries. Don't tell me what to do. But in the Christian understanding of the world, the medieval understanding of the world, God's limits are his love to us. He gives us a framework for living, a form. And there's all kinds of freedom within that form. But he gives us limits. He gives us boundaries. She continues to say, God's law, natural limits express the truth that is best for mankind. Modern man thinks boundaries and limitations should be crossed. Break those boundaries, right? Break that glass ceiling. Courage, be autonomous. But crossing boundaries destroys your soul. It brings chaos. There you go. Can't replace that. G.K. Chesterton says this about Macbeth, and I think it's worth noting, so I'm just going to read it to you. Here, I say, is the first and most formidable of the great actualities on Macbeth. This is G.K. Chesterton. You cannot do a bad thing in order to reach sanity. You can't kill the king to get your way. The crime does not get rid of the problem. Make a morbid decision and you will only become more morbid. Do a lawless thing and you only get an atmosphere much more suffocating than that of the law. It is a mistake to speak of a man as breaking out, breaking free. A lawless man never breaks out. He breaks in. He smashes the door and finds himself in another room. He smashes the wall and finds himself yet in a smaller one. The more he shatters, the more his habitation begins to shrink. His world gets smaller. Where he ends, you may read at the end of it. That's G.K. Chesterton. I love that. Our lawless acts limit us. So if we throw out this idea of the medieval cosmology, you're allowing disorder and dysfunction. And we're going to see this in literature over and over again. And that's why it's important for us to talk about it. If you know me, you know we're going to talk about this again. It'll come up over and over. but we best move on. My goal here is to paint with a broad brush and give you a big picture of literary time periods before jumping into our first book, Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Okay, let me advance the slide. So what are some literary works of medieval England? So we had the Anglo-Saxons, and now we have the medievals. Some names that are associated with medieval literary period in England are important to throw out there. Here's some pictures. Geoffrey Chaucer is the writer of Canterbury Tales, and Foursquare, if you're in Foursquare, I know some of you were my students when you were in 7th grade, and we read The Pardoner's Tale and The Knight's Tale from Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer is extremely influential on Shakespeare. Remember that stories relate to stories. Much of what Shakespeare writes, he is drawing on stories that came before him, the literary tradition that passed on. Of course, we have the Gawain poet of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We don't know his names. We just call him the Gawain poet. We don't, he's sometimes called the Pearl poet because the story is in a collection with a story called the Pearl. Or a poem called the Pearl. This story draws from the courtly love tradition. A knight on a quest. Will he be true to his calling? Will he be faithful and honest? Some of you have read this story with me, either at First Edition or at Libertas. I think some of you read it there as well. So Sir Gawain the Green Knight is an important medieval piece of writing. What else do you see in these pictures? What do you recognize? We have important writers who give us Arthur tales, King Arthur. Geoffrey of Monmouth and Thomas Malory. So you have these King Arthur tales and the world of the chivalric romance. Why learn about the Anglo-Saxons and the medievals? We're just barely scratching the surface on these literary time periods, but it's helpful to have this framework and understanding that when we start to read Shakespeare and we look at his works, that we see he is working in a very well-established literary tradition. He's a genius. He's brilliant. He was very inventive, but only one of his stories that we know of has no source story. All his other plays have source stories that he is drawing from and making them his own, changing the way they go or mashing up a couple of different stories. Shakespeare is the bard for all time, and he's often considered the greatest English writer. But he was standing on the shoulders of a long history of marvelous stories of love and war and intrigue and wonder, and he pulls from that literary tradition in his works. I hope you've taken a few notes. I will pull the literary time period slide back up here, and you can freeze it and pause it if you need to get that down. But for our reading, we are going to begin with William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Very excited to read this story together, and we will have separate videos for the play. When we get to Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5, I'll just shoot out a couple different videos for those. I'm going to leave you with a quote from C.S. Lewis. This is from Out of the Silent Planet, his kind of sci-fi trilogy. He writes this: "A man who has been in another world does not come back unchanged." My hope and prayer for you this year is that you enter a new world of stories and that you will not be unchanged. God bless, and I will see you either in class or in the next video. We'll pull up the last slide here about there. We'll turn to that. If you need to pause it, go right ahead. Otherwise, God bless, and we'll see you soon.